I would like to keep this informal. I have a series of slides that are not designed as presentations, but are really put together as discussion. So let me bring that up. Okay, hopefully everyone should be able to see the slides. And again, what I've got here is a series of discussion points. They're kind of just thrown together. What I've been having kicking around my mind for the last couple years, and I'm now really trying to bring it all together. And what you have here is a series of what might be called notes that I'm now consolidating and have a desire to eventually bring it to just a single infographic. On the groundwork, though, there's always the question of a 70% change failure rate. This has been around for years and is really so common that it's really just accepted. And back in 2004, when I was doing my dissertation, I actually had referenced this, and a person on my dissertation committee wanted me to document it. It was kind of interesting because I had seen the statistic so often repeated that I just took it as, as fact, but he required me to go back and actually document it. And I was able to do so, but I really didn't find good documentation. Part of it is that the topic of failure rate is really difficult to research. And this is because too often the change objectives are not documented in advance. The metrics aren't put in place for even tracking progress toward the change objective. And in the area of many changes, the objective itself is also subject to change as more is learned, all of which makes it very difficult to do any type of research on change failure. Nonetheless, though, it's really accepted by many authors, and I was able to easily document many people who had used that statistic. And to some extent, is probably a realistic statistic relative to transformational change, which is difficult. But again, it's difficult to really document, but at the same time, it is somewhat supported by McKinsey. McKinsey's doing annual surveys of CEOs, and very frequently, the answers to a question on CEO satisfaction with change efforts comes within like 27 to 33% satisfaction, which pretty much matches that failure rate. But again, this is based upon a satisfaction of change as indicated by the CEO who is wanting to change the organization. So the key then is really, why does this change failure exist? And why has it been so unchanged and not really addressed in the 20 years that I've been tracking the statistic? Part of it then is a question of what is limiting the change success itself. And this is where Reg Butterfield and I were about 4 years ago. We were looking at what we thought was the need for change models, new change models to address this failure rate. The more we got into it, though, the more we realized that it really wasn't change models themselves that were defective. It was the organization designs that were limiting change itself. The organizations were built more for controlling work than producing work. And this is a challenge that we kind of shifted our mindset apart. And much of what we do for the last few years now has been within figuring out how to really rethink not only what change is in organizations, but how to structure the organizations for change and not for control. Any questions at this point? Any comments? Let me go forward then. This is from Humanocracy, a book that was written by Gary Hamel a year ago. And the information here was really in a table that was looking at an industrial era. And what he really didn't describe per se, but I'm describing as a new era. And we've been talking about the New Era organization for years. So this is basically a side-by-side comparison on too often what we have versus what we need, looking at it from many different dimensions, from the goals of the risk-taking. And risk-taking really gets down to many different areas as to how you think about risk and how you analyze and really make the decisions themselves. There's issues of speed, and really this gets into a whole bunch of other adjacent issues of agility and flexibility, what you think about creativity, and at the heart of it is also then the organization structure and how the decisions are made, and to the extent how really people are empowered. And this gets into empowerment viewed as something that is explicitly granted to somebody versus a self-empowerment point of view of testing boundaries. And again, this gets into a lot of the cultural issues in organizations. It also gets into how people are really looked at as being compliant versus, passionate for the work. Are they really committed, or are they just doing what is needed to comply with the requirements being forced upon them? And then it gets into many other related issues around conformity itself. So these were put together in a book that really was advocating for a more human-centric point of view versus a mechanical or industrial point of view of the organization. But at the same time, it touches upon many different aspects of how organizations are designed to operate. Any comments here? Let me jump forward then into another book a year earlier called Brave New Work. It's looking at the organization not only from a humanistic point of view, but also how it looks at complexity of the decisions and the issues faced. Again, a laundry list of issues here that has a great overlap with humanocracy. It treats the issues of how people are involved in the decision-making process. We are not acted on being changed, but are really more participants. The role of self-managed versus being managed. It gets into a number of related issues as to not only participation, but the benefits associated from such participation. The issues of diversity, and this is really not necessarily limited to the legal issues around diversity as much as it is the mental models and the experiences that people bring. This is a much more robust thinking about diversity and how those different thought paradigms can influence an organization and how that organization approaches its decision-making. He talks greatly about the innovation, need for experimentation. Okay. The creativity, entrepreneurial versus the traditional elites making the decisions and then having others implement them. Issues of decentralizations, how you control the decision-making process. Any questions here? Anything that might strike you as interesting or different? Okay, looking forward then, we have a number of different attributes of organizations that were written about in the last 2 years. But if you go back 20 years, In an article in Strategy and Leadership, you see virtually the exact same types of issues. This was talking about cultures and what was needed for the new economy. Again, the new economy was being described 20 years ago. It was looking at the machine versus natural system as a central metaphor, the exact same type of metaphors we're talking about today. The issues of how we act toward people, the issues surrounding trust, the capabilities, the structure we use. And this was interesting in that they were advocating 20 years ago the need to move from a hierarchical structure to a network structure. The whole area around leadership as being rare and an all-knowing, charismatic, heroic type of leader versus a distributed leadership model. In the area of management, talking about command and control versus more autonomous operations, and really even the value of culture. Within a machine, culture really not necessary, but within a more robust knowledge worker environment, culture becomes essential because it's more people oriented. Now, this raises some issues, and I've been collecting articles. And again, the articles I've been collecting for the most part go back to the late 90s when I was working on my doctorate degree. Many boxes of articles were photocopied and were used for different research papers. And I kept many of them, and I periodically will go through them. And what occurred to me, and this is one of them, is how much of what is being written about today is not new, but a generation from before. So we've gone a full generation talking about the same things without really making progress. Now, that's not to say that there hasn't been some progress. You can probably identify easily a dozen are small organizations and a couple larger organizations that are doing some things very interesting, that are breaking through some of the industrial paradigms. But for the most part, the default paradigm is still the industrial era model, even though we've been advocating the need for something new for 20 years. Going forward then, let's go back not just 20 years ago, let's go back 25 years ago. This was Margaret Wheatley writing one of the many articles that she's written over the years. Okay. And this was talking about the future of organizations from her point of view. And again, this is 25 years ago now. She was advocating the point of view that change failure itself is how we think about organizations as machines, which gets right back to where Reg and I came, in that it's the structure of the organization, the operating styles that we use, that is really the limitation itself. And that the machines were designed without an ability to change because they were designed for stability and production of mass identical types of outcomes. So that she was advocating the need to go to living systems. And this is one of the first living organization references that you might run into. And she identified a number of attributes, and the attributes are listed here. It needs to be more adaptive, flexible, self-organizing and self-renewing, resilient, learning, and intelligent. These are all attributes we've been talking about now for 25 years of how to put them into organizations. Back in the 90s, the living organization was a really hot topic. And this was part of what led into that discussion. But there's remnants of that still. But if you take a look at the vision, it really hasn't yet been fully realized. Then talking about the, let me check something here real quick. The whole issue here then is the need to organize for change. And this was a key point that was made in this article 25 years ago. In that, while we may think of structures as being permanent, really they're temporary. And what you run into then is a series of reorganizations to basically restructure what's permanent, because it is not really permanent. It's only temporary because of the needs that are changing. People themselves are dynamically moving around. They're dynamically interacting. It's the informal organization that is driving change to a large extent, or I should say the need for change. Much of the focus is on resource allocation, and then that gets into a whole series of power structures and conflicts over those resources. There's a need for emergent leadership, but at the same time, we have a leadership model that is designed around a command and control model, not necessarily a shared or participatory model. We need to move more toward experimentations, local solutions that can be tested in other locations, but again, more localized decision-making that can be rapidly expanded and diffused across the organization. These are things that she identified 25 years ago. She also then focused to a large extent on the area of informal organizations. Much of what was an informal organization was recognized but ignored. It was designed in the background to work around the problems that the formal organization had. And to some extent, simple rules were developed within this informal organization to allow things to happen. Okay. Any questions or comments in on where we are today versus the vision from 20, 25 years ago and the similarity?
I would just ask, why aren't more organizations willing to get out of this thinking, this mindset of command and control, hierarchy, and the leaders? It's more like a parent-child relationship than it is an employee and employer relationship, and it does stifle creativity and innovation. And why aren't more organizations on board to change?
That's an excellent question that Reg and I have been asking ourselves for a while now. And I think to a large extent, there's a couple factors at play. One is, by looking at this, we're identifying a paradigm, and we can define the paradigm and what is inside and outside. Okay. At the same time, the people that are living that paradigm are inside and they don't see any outside. I've also often thought that it's easy to tell somebody to get out of the box because you see the box that they're in, but when they're inside the box, all they see is the room that they're in. There is no box. It's just their room. It's their world. To some extent, I think that's at play here, in that for the most part, what is still even being taught in business schools is a traditional model. There are some introductions to living organizations, natural systems, complexity science, but the textbooks themselves are probably dominated 80, 90% still of the industrial era model, because the research that is often done is based upon what is in place right now. You also have, I think, a challenge of observational learning. Managers, for the most part, do what they've seen others do. To some extent, if they've seen failures from others, they may be able to learn from that, but only to the extent that they see an alternative that's a viable alternative. I think you also have another greater issue here, and that revolves around trust itself, in that there is a lack of trust that's across the organization because of the power structures that are embedded in a traditional hierarchy. It almost enables and encourages that lack of trust because of how the power is utilized or could be utilized. And there's some extent that if you give up too much power, you become vulnerable, and then that creates a fear cycle. So you get a whole bunch of psychological issues that are at play. And some of the power and the benefits that go with that power then are very real. And that the people that often need to change the most have the most at risk. There's been a general trend at flattening an organization. That's streamlined some of it. It's taken out most of the middle management, issues. And it gets back to, as a comment just come up here about fear of losing control. Yep. And that's a real fear of what do you do when you don't have control? What do you do when you have to trust others? And again, trust is bi-directional in that people aren't going to give you their trust unless they feel trusted, and vice versa. So you get into a whole series of almost negative feedback loops around trust appearing vulnerable. You also get into some traditional models of leadership. And if you're around for the clubhouse in a couple hours, we're going to be talking about different leadership models, which this is part of the heart of that. Of a traditional model is an all-knowing person that is promoted to a position of authority based upon their abilities, but that carries some baggage of expectations that they are all-knowing. But to the extent that they are promoted, they get further away from really the knowledge that's needed, so that they're dependent then upon people below them to give information so that they can act. But at the same time, due to the lack of trust, there's the filtering of information such that they are only given what really isn't damaging to the people who are having to give it upward. So you get into some really bad organization dynamics themselves that really encourage that cycle. You also then get into how do you make the change? And we've had some webinars this in the past of how do you move from a traditional command and control hierarchy to a networked organization. And there's a number of things that you can do. Part of it requires a vision, but it also requires doing a number of things that get you closer to that vision. When you look at successful organizations, there's a number of small organizations that are using different distributed decision-making models built around holacracy or sociocracy. But for the most part, they're, in my opinion, they're trading one type of decision-making bureaucracy for another bureaucratic group process that is overly documented in many cases, so that you're doing things that could be more efficient, but it requires an enormous infrastructure to enable the quicker decisions later. So it's a trade-off there. It works well in small organizations that can deal with that type of upfront foundation building, but in larger organizations it is really difficult to put in place and has not worked well when tried. The other areas is something like Hire Corporation, which has a visionary leader. It was going through a near-death crisis. A visionary leader came in and put some things in place that was really a distributed making network approach that he, over the last 20 years, has continued to support, such that it was a crisis which is often the burning platform that we talk about in organizational change, that was advantaged to put a new structure in place. And again, because he was at the top, he was able to basically champion that structure going forward. He's in the process now of stepping back to a lesser role, and it'll be interesting to see how that continues. They have some confidence that there's enough of leadership across the organization that it will be able to continue, but that is really mandated upon those people that have grown up in that organization continue in that mode of operation, which I think will be successful. In another case, you've got the Gore Corporation is also frequently mentioned as forward thinking, but again, they came into building the company around their patents using a mental model of equality of decision-making, people being trusted. And they put together very early on a series of principles that they built the company around. So again, it was almost a startup situation that they were able to maintain because of the principles that were put in place. Beyond that, though, the real challenge is first awareness, and then secondly, a desire to overcome the fear, become vulnerable, and get into a sharing of power for the greater good. And this gets into one of the issues of humanocracy, in that they lay out that vision, but then they say a moral imperative is really needed. And they equated that moral imperative to the overcoming of slavery, the women's suffrage movement, the labor movement, all of which were mass social movements. Something like that, in their opinion, is required. But again, how do you reach that critical mass? What's the tipping point for actions? That is the real challenge we have before us, other than dissatisfaction. And I think it's going to be interesting to see where this post-pandemic goes. The pandemic has been disruptive enough of how we operate organizations and raised and changed expectations. There's a lot of discussions as to the mass attrition that companies are facing. People are becoming much more mobile. They're looking for new things. To the extent that organizations only give them the old benefit, the old way of doing business, I don't know if that's going to be survivable. The newer organizations can easily take the place, and it may become a mass evolution based upon who's able to attract the workers that are now very mobile and thinking mobility of job due to dissatisfactions with the way things had been in the past and the dissatisfactions on the way things are starting to go back to. Okay. Other questions on your point or comments?
No, you mentioned this, but I was going to say that this great resignation that we're in right now, maybe that's the social movement that we need to put this in place.
It actually may be, because up until now, it's been a lot of people being dissatisfied, but the collective action really hasn't been there. They haven't taken to the streets, but at the same time, if you take a look now, okay, what are the streets? Back in the women's suffrage movement, the labor movement, the civil rights movement, all of that was literally the streets with protest. Now, if you want to say what is the street, you might say social media might be the street. And to the extent that people are voicing dissatisfaction and are giving voice to that dissatisfaction on social media, that might be this beginning of a social movement. It's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. right now, the power is with the employees. And I think that gives them further advantage at asking for things that they want. The bigger challenge then is that's a big gap. What we're talking about here for the vision of the future versus an industrial model is a big gap. In which case, our company is going to face up and deal with that. Are they going to try to deal with it piecemeal and appeasement, or are the disruptive organizations going to really step in? And that's often what happens in large evolutionary movements. And disruptive innovation comes in. And in this case, the innovation isn't really new ideas, but implementing ideas on a mass scale. If you then go forward and put together, okay, what are some of the key requirements? Okay. This is basically taking the few slides earlier and trying to distill it down into a shorter list. The list of things that we're going to be needing going forward if we're going to try to have a more flexible, adaptive organization. That's also not only adaptive and quick, but treating people as a human knowledge component of the organization and not a part of an interchangeable machine. This is then requiring quicker decision making, but also the flexibility to change direction. It's not just the ability to be quick, but it's the ability to change from one direction to another based upon the changing needs. It's a resource allocation approach. It's an entrepreneurial thinking, and this gets into entrepreneurialism is often lost as organizations grow. As the organizations grow, there is a tendency to have bureaucracy built in, which gets in, I think, to the paradigm in that when a startup organization grows, they realize that the small hub and spoke organization no longer works. And they then look to other organizations as a template model for their use, which basically takes that simple hub and spoke and just enlarges all of the connections that you then have a massive hub and spoke, which is often then redrawn as a traditional top-down hierarchy. Okay. When you look, though, at the successful entrepreneurs, there is a theory of effectuation that gets into the principles that drive entrepreneurial success. If an organization identifies those key principles and then protects them from change, that then prevents really a movement toward bureaucracy and is able to retain the essentials of what an entrepreneurial organization is as it grows. This gets into one of the challenges of change. When you look at change resistance, oftentimes that resistance is focused on what people don't want to change and is actually out of scope of the change, but there's fear that it will be changed because the change initiative only talks about what is being changed. It doesn't really do equal focus on what is critical not to be changed. In this case, what are the key principles of entrepreneurship that is essential to retain for that quickness that a startup has as it grows into its next phase of evolution? This gets into, obviously, the risk taking, how you approach risk, how you think about it, even the purpose of an organization that is not only customer driven with external customer viewpoints, but how you think about your internal customers. Oftentimes, those staff organizations are really focused on internal customers, but they don't have that same customer mindset. They are more of a command, do this because I'm knowledgeable in this area of staff work. goes back to collaboration and trust, key issues. People, not machine parts. Again, it's thinking about organizations differently, but it also gets down to how do you release the people's passion for their work? How do you gain commitment and not just mere compliance? Going then into what does this really mean for the principles themselves? Okay, how do you design principles that are built for change? Let me go through these somewhat quickly because I'm now in the process of trying to really simplify them further. What I've done on this slide is take the information on the vision, the needs, and try to build them into some principles that can be put in place. Because if you're able to build an organization around principles and values, it really becomes driven by the culture itself versus having that really control being embedded in the decision-making process and the structure of the hierarchy and bureaucracy. So we're looking then at some type of need for autonomy that is action-oriented. And this is really a timely decision-making that is principle-based. And again, when you do away with bureaucracy, you're doing away with the control of the bureaucracy, but you're not doing away with the need for some control. So within the principles, there is some tensions such that principles will allow you to go in one direction, but another principle will give some boundary and tension to keep you going from too far. When you're building these principles, then they are giving you the guidelines and they're really the guardrails, similar to on a road, but the guardrails are on both sides of the road. They're not just on one side, allowing you to go indiscriminately in the other direction. We're also talking about then people that are acting in consultation with others. This is a collaboration. It's a look of accepting risk as an affordable. Traditional risk management looks at an expected value of the risk. And it looks at it from an economic point of view and how you're able to really make the decision on a strictly economic basis, while at the same time, really the risk management people focus on how to reduce the risk, how to control that risk. But at the same time, you can have those outliers that could exist. The low probability, high impacts can still exist because in the probability, they're watered down in the impact. Flip that around though, an entrepreneur looks at it very differently. They don't do risk management. They're able to make the decisions based upon whether the downside is affordable. If you can live through any negatives associated with the possibilities of an outlier, then you move forward and you're able to move forward quickly and recognize when that downside is occurring and quickly reverse course. So it's a different thought process of risk itself. It gets also then into the whole sense making built around effectuation or the entrepreneurial mindset. We're also talking about the responsiveness that is purpose driven. This is a customer orientation, both the internal and external customers, so that everyone has line of sight from their job to the organization outcomes. There is a traditional challenge within performance management systems on how to build that line of sight so that people know how their job applies to the greater organization's purpose. By pushing this down into internal customer relationships, that becomes much more visible to them, and that you don't necessarily need to work toward line of sight because it's visible to them every day in what they do. We're also then talking about opening up the lines of communication such that things don't have to go up an organization, across, and then down to communicate. The informal organization and the communication networks that are built in the informal organization then become more formalized themselves, such that people are talking routinely with those that they need. It also gets into a network weaver operation, such that people are being brought together ad hoc or as well as on a more permanent basis to meet the needs and possibly the shifting needs of the organization. We also then talk about how you do alignment through the cross-organization linkages. How do you address the boundary conflicts that will invariably occur in a siloed organization where there are power structure and limited decision rights? How do you do that with a minimal structure that is easily modifiable versus having to rapidly go from one major reorganization of a static hierarchy into another static hierarchy? Further then is, how do you really put aside the time to do this purpose alignment that is not overlooked in your firefighting? Oftentimes when organizations look at why they failed, it was because they didn't do the things that they knew that they needed to do. They were too busy fighting the immediate problems to really look at the longer term higher priorities. This is a challenge until you think about how to set aside the time formally to do what you need to do. Okay, and that's not easy to do without a conscious decision. Okay. Questions or comments on this? Let me go forward. This is the last slide I've got. This is where my mind is at right now. Okay. What you have to this point is a thought process, starting with the vision that people have now, how that vision has been unchanged over the last 20 to 25 years, how to distill that vision down into key requirements, into the principles of operation. And now, how do you then simplify it even further such that eventually we can get this down to what I'm shooting for is one page. One page that basically shows the current situation and the vision itself. And that gap then sets the stage on how to individually close parts of this challenge, as well as eventually collectively closing the gap. Okay. This then kind of is my work in progress right now. Let me let you have a few minutes look through that and give me your comments on what you see as possibly being missing, confusing, or even redundant. Go ahead. Jump in with your comment.
Yeah. So I have looked at your presentation here, your PowerPoint, and I think it really hits the point right where every organization is really struggling. Right. But we know what we need, because what you have written here in relation to what we desire is what I would say in my organization is what the employees say all the time during a review of our strategic period. So you'd find that we design a 5-year strategy, and halfway into implementation, we would review it. We would look at some of the issues that are deterring us from achieving our goals and all that. And most of what we desire that you have captured here is what comes out. But then the biggest challenge is, it's like we don't then know how to achieve, to move to that desire, or to realizing this need. We don't know how to move away from, for instance, internal power dynamics that are existing in the organization. We don't know how to relinquish the decision-making powers that have been concentrated into a few individuals in an organization. We don't know how to break, the hierarchical walls that we have built, and I think it really would be if there is a model that really eases people or eases organization into transition into what they achieving what they desire. I think it would really make a big difference, because it's one thing for the organization to always be saying we need this for a good 10-15 years, and it's another to actually move towards achieving it.
Yep,
and I think it takes guts.
Yeah, I agree, and Reg and I are working toward that right now. We're working with one large multinational company who is implementing a number of our concepts, and we're learning as we go. It's impossible to do everything at once. So the challenge is to figure out what are the key components and how to put some of those key components in place. Part of the key components is thinking about principles. Okay, to the extent that you're having operating principles and focus on them, that provides the guidance for people to take action without being explicitly directed. Some of those principles are specific things that are done and how they're done. Others are more just a raising awareness issue. And my next step is to try to start to make those differentiations. What do you basically put aside as an awareness issue, and that you always need to keep front and center as an awareness, because it drives a number of other processes themselves. It becomes more of a foundation. What we're talking about here is really two things. One is a general attitude toward transparency. And transparency is twofold. One is the open sharing of information and the attitude toward that sharing. And a second part of awareness is the open sharing of motivations, why people are doing what they're doing, which this starts then to get into areas of foundation building for trust. So that if you have an attitude toward transparency, that then becomes really the background for a number of other things that will build upon that as a foundation. The other is, I think, an awareness that too often we build organizations for control versus the production of work. And this gets into a large amount of the metric systems, the decision rights authority. And again, if you recognize that there's a difference between controlling work and producing work, and that's kept in the background all the time, that becomes foundational for a number of other issues themselves that will arise on a daily basis. Those become what I'm thinking of really the foundational awareness principles. Then you get into a couple that are more daily operational. What we're starting with there is really purpose alignment. How do you gain purpose alignment outside of a top-down hierarchy? Okay, and this gets into an interesting discussion on how do you then deal with the important things? How do you pull time out of an organization to deal with what really needs to be done and not have them encumbered by the firefighting daily activities? This gets into a new way of thinking about really leadership itself. And this is what we're going to be talking about in the clubhouse later today, on leadership as a construct built around direction, alignment, and commitment. It's a higher level of leadership model. But once you think about leadership from those three functional areas, you really start to do things different. You organize different. And that then opens up new possibilities. This is part of a stair-step process. The question then would obviously come is, where do you start and what is a sequence? And I'm not sure there's any answer to that. Generally, you start where you can, you do what you can while keeping in mind the greater vision, and to the extent that you're able to test things out, you do so. To the extent that they work or can be modified to work elsewhere, you do so. Reg and I have done a couple of webinars on that already. We probably need to now start to put more of it into a few summary pages that people can use. Because, I mean, what's out there is almost too complex. For example, what's in Digham's book, he breaks this down into 12 different operating systems. From an academic point of view, I find it interesting. From a practical management point of view, it's almost overwhelming. It's too much. Where do you start? Even in Humanocracy, it's almost too much. It needs to be distilled down into pieces that make sense. And to some extent, Humanocracy does that toward the end of the book. It breaks it into pieces that can be implemented. But the bigger problem with the Humanocracy in those pieces is that they're disjointed. They're not really put together into any type of categorization that makes sense or in relationship to others. That's kind of the missing piece in that particular book. On the Clubhouse, take a look at the Futocracy.network event. It will be listed as an event that starts 3 hours after this one started. So basically it'd be starting 2 hours from now. There is a link there. Note though that Clubhouse only operates on smartphones. Okay, it's a different type of application. You cannot access it via your PC or your Mac. It's only on smartphones. You need to download the smartphone app. And then once you're there, then you get into the, it's not a room, it's kind of a gathering space. And Clubhouse is audio only, just talking. So I've got a whole series of slides and talking points, and it will be similar to just an open conversation. To the extent that people ask questions similar to here, I will speak to those questions, but it becomes much more interactive because of the environment is built for interactivity versus presentation. So look at the event on Futocracy.network. Okay. Anything else for today's and next steps? And again, my next step here is to put this into a single page. It might just be similar to this, ideally with a little bit more infographic content. And then from that will be linkages to different individual components and how to move those components forward while still maintaining some relationship about how everything fits together. Questions? Anything else for today?
No, not from me. Thank you for the presentation. I really learned a lot, and
Okay.
I appreciate you sharing this knowledge.
Okay. Well, it's to my benefit also, and that part of the reason we share it is to get feedback from others, to see the questions that they're asking, what they understand, what they don't understand. So your feedback, your questions have been beneficial to help the learning process that Reg and I are going through. So excellent. I wish you have a good day.